In today's video, Thrity Umrigar's follow-up novel to Honor, the Museum of Disappointment, the fallout of a conservative Jewish school covering up sexual abuse in Abomination by Ashley Goldberg, the delightful feel-good Japanese novel Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, Valerie Perrin's Freshwater for Flowers, Nisha Dolan's follow-up to Exciting Times, The Leftover Women by Jean Kwok, Vaishnavi Patel's retelling of the Ramayana, and DNFs are back. Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome back to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, a channel where I discuss literary fiction, new releases, and global literature. If that's your thing and you're new here, consider hitting that subscribe button and stay tuned because we're going to talk about books. So let's crack right on with the DNFs, and I have 4 of them. Mr. I just didn't get on with the writing in this novel. It felt stilted and unnatural to me. I've had a few people question me on whether it is fair to review a book which I didn't finish. I think that's actually a really fair question. My experiences are not going to be universal, but I'll always let you know why a book doesn't work for me. Hopefully, once you've watched a few of these, you'll learn when our tastes are similar and when our tastes differ, and you'll learn when I say I don't like the writing in this novel, whether you should ignore that or whether that is a red flag for you. I don't really think that what I have given Mr. is a review anyway. It's more of a comment. I will give books a review if I think I've read enough to comment on an aspect of a book. This is Salvaged by Vanuri Vara. When you find a quality author who has written a fantastic novel, and in Vara's case, The Immortal King Raoul is a fantastic novel, it's always nerve-wracking when they follow that up with a short story collection. While I did finish and I even enjoyed some of the short story collections later in this video, I definitely wouldn't say that short story collections are particularly my thing. But I also think there are very few authors who are talented enough to do both novels and short stories. The reason I don't like short stories is unless they're done really well, I just find them like really overly simple novels and they just don't really engage me. They just feel too basic for me, and that is exactly what's happened here. Inflamed by Rupa Marya and Raj Patel. I really didn't like this non-fiction. Marya and Patel are linking immigration to immunity, and either I'm completely misunderstanding their metaphor, or, and I think this is the real issue, they're not bringing the receipts for their claims. I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm saying I'm not satisfied with their proof. I'm not satisfied with their argument. I'm saying if they were undergraduate science students and I was marking their work, I would fail them. Not that what they're saying isn't interesting, but that they can't construct an argument. And I guess this is the danger in DNFing a book like this. The proofs and references I could be asking for, they could come later in this non-fiction, but I want my proofs with the claims. I want the argument to be built on those proofs. The Happy Couple, Nisha Dolan. I really enjoyed Exciting Times, but this just isn't as good. I'm sorry. This is an Irish author with a book I didn't like. Wow, there is one. I probably could have actually finished this novel on another day if I was feeling more tolerant, but the pacing here was just too quick. If your book is about characters need to be done well. They need to be built and well developed and distinct. And if that means the pacing needs to be slow, then the pacing needs to be slow. That's the end of the DNFs. I've got 11 books I've finished, and you'll want to wait to the end because I am going through them from worst to best. And we're starting with The Diary of a Nobody by George Grossman. This is a rather silly Victorian comedy novel about an upwardly mobile, middle-class, snobbish idiot, his wife, and his son. Not a lot happens in this novel, but that's kind of the point. It's a middle-class satire. It was not laugh out loud funny, but it did have a comical setup to it, a comical feel to it. This reads like a really, really raw P.G. Wodehouse novel, and that's really my issue with this book. As I was reading it, I just kept thinking, this is Wodehouse, but rubbish. Wodehouse could have done something better and it would have been more enjoyable. The execution was a bit below average, the jokes were derivative and not particularly funny, and it was still enjoyable, but more in a I'm tired and I want mindless entertainment style than I want to read a good book style. Call and Response, Gothataone Moeng. This is a collection of short stories from Botswana, and it's a collection where women are central to the stories. Let's just cut to the chase here. As a collection of short stories, this is relatively forgettable. But if you're interested in fiction that shows you examples of a culture, transports you to a setting, and gives you a feel of life in Botswana, then this is excellent. Is it great literature? No. But there is a compelling reason to read it regardless. The Secret Lives of Segi's Wives. This is a 2010 Nigerian novel about Segi's 3 existing wives and his new 4th wife, Bolanle, who is not given a particularly warm welcoming. One of the things I found very interesting is this showed a kind of cultural divide within Nigeria. Bolanle is not the typical sort of woman who marries a polygamist. And it was very interesting to see that kind of keeping up with the Joneses aspect of Nigerian society. This book is feminist. It is particularly critical of the role that women play within Nigerian society, their opinions, their lack of ability to determine their future openly. It particularly looks at polygamy, infighting between wives, the value placed upon men and women, domestic violence, class, education. It has drama, it has a secret, and it has a very satisfying plot. The trouble with this book really is other books such as Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo or His Only Wife by Peace Adzomidi. These are books that would have been inspired by Segi's wives, and they have taken that as a base and they've improved upon it. The Secret Lives of Segi's Wives was first, but it has definitely been superseded, I'm sorry to say. The Leftover Women. This is one of these challenging novels to review because there are a few secrets along the way, and discovering them is really important to how the plot works and the building of suspense and really just your enjoyment of the novel. Set in China and the US, this is a historical fiction with elements of suspense and mystery that explores motherhood, China's one nation policy, sex work, white privilege, financial privilege, power, abuse, love, nannies, the relationship between children and hired domestics, cultural identity, domestic violence, immigration, illegal immigration, the exploitation of illegal immigrants, adoption, corruption, rural China, and the value of girl children versus boy children in rural China. Part of this novel involves Rebecca and Jasmine. Rebecca has adopted a Chinese baby and is jealous of Jasmine, her Chinese nanny. Rebecca suspects Jasmine of sleeping with her husband, but relies on her to help with her daughter. Their relationship is really quite interesting. It raises these questions about adopting children from another culture, about hiring people to help raise your children, about the role of these various people and influences in who your child becomes, about the roles of women within heterosexual relationships and the securities they have in those relationships and how they think that they're thought of by their partner. This is not a bad book, but I think it really wants to be that commercial fiction novel that does literary fiction well too. And I think it's kind of ended up as a jack of all trades, master of none kind of book. The themes are all interesting. There's nothing particularly wrong with the exploration, except they were a little bit too light. And the plot is enjoyable, but all the mysteries along the way were pretty obvious. The sex club stuff, that was interesting, but it was a bit sanitized. And while I understood the point of it, it never really went anywhere. This is actually a bit of a frustrating book because it had a lot going for it. Jean Kwok is talented. I will read her next book, but she needs to figure out her writing identity. She needs to figure out exactly what she's doing in her books. She needs to try to do just a little bit less and do what she's doing perfectly. The quality of the books really improves from now on. These are the books that at the end you'll complain you've added to your TBR, and how on earth are you meant to read them all? Days at the Morisaki Bookshop. Tatako is 25 years old and she has just been dumped. Actually, her partner didn't just dump her, he revealed he was marrying somebody else. And I get seeing somebody else. I mean, you should dump the person you're with before you start a new relationship, but I do get it. There are circumstances. But if you're in that relationship long enough to know that you want to marry that person before you dump the other person, you really need to consider what sort of human being you actually are. And once you've done that, you should enter politics, or at least HR. Anyway, this is centering the wrong person. Poor heartbroken Takeyato takes up her uncle Satori's offer to come and help him with his bookshop. Despite the two hardly ever seeing each other, Satoru has a soft spot for Takako. She has always been a favourite of his. Satoru has dedicated his life to the bookshop after his wife Momoko left him 5 years ago. Ultimately, this is a novel about healing and finding yourself. Satoru is letting Totoko in on his life. There are so many aspects of this, but my personal favourite example, Takako doesn't really like books, but Satoru loves them, and we witness this slow transformation and this developing of a love for reading and books and literature in Totoko. And this isn't just a one-way relationship. Satoru is not as happy as he seems. He is still upset over the loss of his wife. This is something that Tatako can help him with. I really love this relationship between uncle and niece. It has this weird blending of friendship and parent-child relationship, and how they both have to adjust from this being an adult-child relationship to this being two adults. I also just love friendship in books where sex is completely off the table. I love age gap platonic love in novels too. This short novel manages to be heartwarming and uplifting while also providing some pretty sad moments. The different types of grief is really a major theme in this novel, and you can't have a book about healing without having heartbreak in it as well. Stoner by John Williams. I buddy read this with two of my absolute favourite booktubers, Jess from Stalking Kafka and Gemma from Gem of Books. If they're booktubers who you're unfamiliar with, please just go and subscribe to them, or at least watch one or two of their videos. I guarantee you won't regret it. This is the story of one man's life in academia, an ordinary, unremarkable life where the little things matter. There are a few important events in Stoner's life. Some of them are typical in a lot of people's lives. Things such as getting married, having a daughter, falling in love. But there are other things important to his life that are super specific to him. The argument over if a certain student should pass or fail, for example. What is really interesting out of all this is that we gain this rather intimate portrait of Stoner, and it raises questions like, what are the important things in life? What should we do with our time? For Stoner, a lot of those choices go back to his job and academia, and we're left with the question, what is the kind of legacy he wants to leave behind? Why is his job so important to him? And subsequently, we can ask these questions about our own lives. I don't think Williams is so much critiquing the role that work plays in both our lives and in our identity, but rather raising the questions, beginning the discussion. So with that in mind, I think that this is an excellent book to buddy read or to read as part of a book club. Stoner is also a very passive character, rarely fighting for the things he wants. And I think that raises the next question. Should Stoner have fought harder for the things that were important to him? And were those sacrifices worthwhile? It's ultimately a game of what if. We're not actually shown an alternative. There is no sliding door moment. But I think one thing that Williams is clear on is if those sacrifices were worth it, what the result of those sacrifices were, and if Stoner should have fought harder for what he wants. When somebody asks, what makes a book a classic? The sort of typical response is something along the lines of the book has some sort of enduring goodness to it. But I don't think that's actually true. Classics are a byproduct of the society that creates them, and as such, they need people to talk about them so that they can remain classics. I think Stoner is the perfect example of that. It is a conversation starter, and even if you, after reading it, think that that act was poor or average, the conversations that come afterwards are going to be really interesting and valuable. And as such, this is a fantastic book to read, and I really recommend it. But I specifically recommend that you read this book with somebody, because in doing that, you will enrich your experience of it tenfold. Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. This is a retelling of the Ramayana. And look, as a Westerner, I'm not raised with these stories as part of my culture, and I've never studied them. I've never read the Ramayana. I have never addressed that particular deficit in my learning. So I can't really comment on how the retelling changed the story in the same way I could if it were a biblical retelling or a Greek myth. But I do know that Kaikeyi is not the central figure of the Ramayana. And who is the central figure of the Ramayana becomes pretty obvious as this story progresses. That is, if you don't figure it out by the names of the characters. This is a feminist retelling. Kaikeyi has been transformed from vilified queen to kick-ass character. She has some real super tough choices to make, and she's really present in them. But this is where not being familiar with the Ramayana impacted my enjoyment. The transformation of the original story was completely lost to me when she was making those choices. And I could definitely see how those choices could have been presented differently. I just didn't know how they were presented. If I were to compare this to something like Stoneblind, who Medusa was in Greek myth versus who Medusa was in that book is super clear. So it's a real pity that I don't have the same knowledge of the Ramayana, because if I were to judge this book based on the storytelling alone, it's one of the best myth retellings I have read in a long time. And this book could have been even better if I had have done a bit of research and a bit of reading or watching YouTube beforehand. So this is a really long-winded way of saying that if you're interested in this book, and I do think you should read it if you haven't read it yet, fall down a YouTube rabbit hole, find the Cliff Notes version of the Ramayana, find a 20-minute video that explains it to you. I guarantee that will enrich your experience of this novel. Kaikeyi is the daughter or princess of one kingdom, and her father wants to marry her into another kingdom to form some sort of alliance. And look, she doesn't want to get married, she doesn't want to leave her home, but she takes agency in one of the only ways she can, by forcing her husband to agree that their child would become ruler of the new country if she accepted his proposal. And the succession of that kingdom is particularly in question, as Kaikeyi won't be his only wife. She will have 2 sister wives, and in the end she will have 4 children to look after, one of which will be hers by blood, 3 of which she will love regardless. And this is the beginning of a game of politics and war and chess, and it's a real political fantasy that is going on here, one of which Kaikeyi is particularly good at because she's endowed with the magic powers of being able to influence people she has a connection with. And I just found this a really satisfying read. I found this plot-wise to be one of the best books I've read in a long time. I just wish I had have taken the time to familiarize myself with Hindu mythology. Freshwater for Flowers by Valerie Perrin. This was a book we read for my wonderful Patreon book club. We had a fantastic discussion of this novel, and I really just want to take the time to thank my Patreons, and special shout out to Janet, who has just signed up in the last week. If you'd like to join us, it would be fantastic if you sign up. We have had some fantastic reads and some fantastic discussions. Violette is the caretaker of a cemetery in small town France. She has 3 grave gravediggers, a priest, and a collection of pets belonging to the deceased to keep her company. One day, Julian, a policeman, comes to ask to deposit his mother's ashes on the gravesite of a stranger. After some small investigations, it becomes clear that this grave was his mother's lover. The story of Julian's mother and her secret lover somehow interlinks with Violette's past. All of this is really just a framing story for the actual story, but it clearly sets up the first major theme of this novel: love, particularly the difference between love and marriage, and when the two don't intersect. And I guess the opposite to love is grief and heartbreak, and this book talks about that too. There are large sections of her life where Violette is looking back at a certain tragedy and the impact that had upon her. And I think that the way this crosses over with the themes of love and marriage is done really perfectly. How characters deal with this tragedy adds so much depth to that conversation. It forces you to empathize with everybody. It forces you to see things from the problematic character's point of view, even the love side of things. This is one of those books that is just going to take you on a bit of a ride, and you're going to feel the emotions deeply, and you're going to get a massive range of emotions. Obviously, there is heartbreak and misery. Obviously, there are moments of tenderness, but there's steamy moments as well. There are moments of disgust. Actually, there's one scene where I think that both of those things are true. There's also rage, jealousy, and injustice. This book explores the difference between the classes in France, and it explores feminist themes. Overall, I just think that this is a fantastic book. The Museum of Failures, Thrity Umrigar. Umrigar's last novel, Honor, was nothing short of excellent. And much like in Honor, our protagonist is somebody who was born in India, moved to the US, built a life there, and is dragged back to India. This time, Remy is back in India to adopt a pregnant woman's baby. While he is back in Bombay, he will visit his elderly mother, who does not have long left to live. Remy finds her in hospital, not talking and seemingly given up on her own life. Once back in India, Remy begins spending time with his mother and old friends, and he starts to uncover a secret family history that he was unaware of. He finally learns the reason why his mother was so cruel to him, and why his father was the exact opposite, and how things are not always what they seem. Remy also spends time with the mother of the child he wishes to adopt, and one of the key themes in this novel is parenthood. And what Umrigar does brilliantly is to explore this from multiple perspectives, giving us a range of views to compare and contrast. Remy is constantly back on the phone with his white wife in the US, and we get to explore what a child would mean to both her and to Remy. We also get to explore what taking away a child will do to somebody if Remy does adopt them. And we get to explore the reason the young girl would be so willing to give up her child, which is to do with her relationship with her father. Then, of course, we're exploring Remy's childhood. There is so many angles in which the parent-child relationship is explored. It really is the major theme of this novel. But another theme that this novel explores is disability. There is a disabled character who enters the story late in this novel, and I think the way Umrigar shows both unconditional love towards this character, but also shows hate and prejudice and everything in between from a variety of different sources, really does demonstrate the range of different experiences people with disabilities could have. And then we start to see the layering, because we have our two major themes, parent-child relationships and disabilities. Well, what about disability within a parent-child relationship? What about disability within parenthood? And then that is explored as well. In places, this novel is dark and heartbreaking, but in other places, it's warm and uplifting. And there are even moments where Remy is with his friend, or when he is recalling meeting his wife for the first time, that the novel dips into being playful and fun. Thrity Umrigar is an author who knows where her talents lie, and she is producing novels in that lane. Well-balanced novels that explore some of the darker sides of life life in India, but that still contain all of the emotions of life. If you're a fan of Honor, then you'll like this. Actually, I see this as really similar to Honor in terms of experience to the reader anyway. The characters are all very different, so too are the plot and the themes, but everything is done in a similar way and to a similar quality. I don't think that this book will change anybody's mind on Thrity Umrigar, regardless of what you think about them. Potential Woman's Prize long list novel right here. Miss Kim Knows by Cho Nam Ju. I've already given this book a dedicated book review. This is one of the few short story collections I have read and really loved. Cho Nam Ju is the author of Kim Jeon, born 1982, which is just a brilliant book. But she's also the author of Saha, which I found pretty disappointing. When I first saw this, I was really excited, but then I was a bit scared. I thought, authors moving from novels to short stories, not always a good idea. And then Saha was Kim Jeon just a one-hit wonder, but it didn't take me long to realize that this was good. 8 stories about 8 women, all aged between 10 and 80. They all have a feminist point of view to discuss. There are hints along the way that the women mentioned in one story are the star of another. I'm not sure if it was done with that intention or if it was done as a way of demonstrating how common the experiences of these women are and to give them a more every woman feel. But I think having the ambiguity is best. What I really love about Cho Nam Ju is that this sounds like a radically progressive feminist book, and reading it doesn't feel like that. There is a simple closing of ambiguity which gives it such clarity. Even if I were inclined to do so, there would be no room to argue with Cho Nam Ju on her points about the treatment of women, which is the point of her writing. Cho Nam Ju isn't interested in whether women are disadvantaged by the system. She isn't interested in whether it is prejudiced against them. She knows that it is. She's interested in how the system impacts the lives of women, which I think is so much more important. And also, anybody thinking that this is a Korean-only problem is wrong. Abomination by Ashley Goldberg. This is another one I've already spoken about in my best backlist books of the year video. I am absolutely flabbergasted that this is a debut novel too. It's about 2 Jewish men who were best friends at high school going to an ultra-Orthodox Jewish school. Ezra's faith has lapsed. Now he identifies as secular. He's never settled down. He doesn't have a great record with relationships. And then there's Jonathan, who is now a rabbi. Jonathan and Ezra meet at a protest. One of the teachers at the school they attended was grooming and raping the students, and when allegations of this hit the media, he fled to Israel with the help of the school. The ultra-conservative Jewish community Jonathan is part of wants to cover this up and have it forgotten. But Jonathan and Ezra are protesting, demanding that the Australian government asks for this man to be extradited so he can face his crimes. That plot bubbles away in the background as these 2 men rekindle their friendship. And as they rekindle their friendship, both men begin to question their faith. Ezra considers rejoining the church, and Jonathan the role the church plays in his life. Ezra is reconnecting with his roots. It never feels like he's truly reconsidering his spiritual side. Jonathan is never considering becoming an atheist, even though they're both questioning. You never doubt that Jonathan will leave the story anything other than Jewish. And by removing that spiritual side of religion, Goldberg is able to discuss the way religion impacts your life, your identity, the community you live in, your family, and your customs. It's able to talk about religion as a culture. The role of women within the Jewish Orthodox Church and the casual racism are also discussed. In one particular scene, Ezra and his girlfriend go over to Jonathan and his wife's house for Shabbat. And while they're there, Jonathan and his wife have a fight. On their way home, Ezra's partner asks if they'll be okay, and Ezra says, "Don't worry about them, they're probably having sex right now," and then explains that good Jewish couples have sex on Shabbat to please God. Am I too black and white with my emotions? I just could not have sex with somebody I hated or was angry with. Also, I really feel like this should have been like the center of a sitcom comic scene where there's an old Jewish couple fighting and then the dialogue is something like this. I hate you. Well, I hate you too. What are you doing? Taking off my pants. Why? If we don't have sex, God will be displeased. Oh, how romantic. Just so you know, I won't be enjoying this. Yeah, well, the last time I enjoyed this, you still had all of your hair. Don't be a fool. I was bald when we got married. I didn't say you were there. I said you still had all of your hair. Silliness aside, this really shows how women are often considered secondary in this form of strict Orthodox Judaism. And that is something that Jonathan struggles to recognize. But as he starts to see that, you sort of see how he is trapped in this religion. It's almost like a Scientology cult style, and how he risks everything if he continues to protest for this sex criminal to be deported. This is such a wonderfully complex book, and I really recommend it. Just like I recommend liking this video and subscribing. Bye bye.